all of that happened with the current planning legislation that we also had when we were still in the European Union. So this stuff is stuff that we co-authored, that we still have in law, and is set to be potentially sunsetted and not replaced in the near future. But despite those protections being in place, this sort of case was made, was, as some people have said, given inadequate space to breathe and to be discussed, and was effectively railroaded through based solely on an ideology, really, an ideological reasoning as to what this space should look like and what economic growth means for this space. Hello and welcome back to Watching Brief for the week of the 3rd of October 2022. I am joined as ever by my co-host, Mr. Andy Brockman, who I imagine this week is likely feeling as though he's part of some coalition of sorts.
Well, yeah, absolutely, Mark. After the Prime Minister's speech at the Conservative Party conference yesterday, I went out and bought myself a new mug. Now, look, here it is. Now, to some viewers, it'll look blank.
Yeah.
But in fact, it's like the magic paper that Doctor Who uses. And if you come from North London or belong to certain think tanks or whatever, it actually says Anti-Growth Coalition.
Oh, right. I see. I see. But the funny thing is I can't read it, so maybe I'm not part of the coalition. It's hard to say. Hard to say. Or maybe the coalition is just made up. Anyway.
You might say that. I could possibly comment on the fact that the Prime Minister may have had to invent another enemy to distract attention from the fact that the government is a complete, as one wit put it, a complete trusterfuck.
Yeah. Insert your skip fire of choice here.
Yeah.
Regardless, though, of straw men, straw women, straw people, straw bloggers arguments being made by people in power, our Watching Brief does continue to bring you elements of the archaeological news of the day for you to comment on and discuss below. And we didn't record last week because we kept on waiting on what people were going to say. For example, the Prime Minister was speaking yesterday, and actually this thing about an anti-growth coalition is very pertinent. She didn't fully spell it out, but what she was talking about was things, for example, that might get in the way of I don't know, building in so-called investment zones, that they have pesky things like the natural environment and the historic environment, or indeed, as you often say, the environment.
Exactly that.
And it's interesting because just before we really get into this, because we want to lay out for you folks a case study as to what can happen, well, frankly, with regulations that already exist, never mind when we're deregulated, but we'll come to that in a moment. But this is important just to note, because I feel as though it's actually a very canny thing to say. Because, for example, on the A303 Stonehenge discussion, some people don't like to call it an argument, although I think it probably is a bit of an argument certainly online.
It's a massive row.
It is a bit of a row, yes. And on
it's gone to the courts and been found to be unlawful.
In that instance, now you might have people who are either deemed to be friendly to the I know they said regime then, to the administration, to the government.
You're almost right.
If they are sort of just blanket pro build, or within the sector, within the archaeological sector, you may well have people now saying, "Oh, you're anti-growth," or indeed, even worse still, as was implied by the speech that she gave, you're unpatriotic. You're not backing Britain if you are seeking to get the best outcome for a UNESCO World Heritage Site in that instance. Or it could be anything. It could be any conversation where archaeologists have a passion for the protection of artifacts and also sites of interest.
Yeah, I mean, being serious for a moment, the criticism is that it's an importation to the UK of, and this isn't just under the new Prime Minister Liz Truss. This is something that people have argued began probably with the Brexit referendum, and certainly continued under the premiership of Boris Johnson, who was forced to resign. It seems like years, but in fact only a few weeks ago. But it's an importation from America of what's called often Trumpian politics. It's a kind of politics where you're either with me or against me. It's deliberately divisive. It's deliberately setting up opposition figures to rail against. Well, and it's arguably really, actually, potentially for society, really dangerous.
It is dangerous because it sets up opposition where opposition doesn't have to exist, and also. It's also, I would say, not a particularly. There's not much of a vision there, is there? If you're just against stuff, what are you for? To misquote Hamilton. Anyway. And I'm sure we'll come back to this again as the argument about deregulation and planning continues through the autumn, as it's scheduled to do. But nonetheless, we have today a warning. A warning that the starting gun, or I suppose starting explosion, was sounded off at the beginning of the previous Culture Secretary's tenure in the job. The Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport in the UK is responsible, amongst other things, for culture, heritage, the historic environment. And when Nadine Dorries, the infamous Nadine Dorries, who thinks that I think the latest thing she said is that the country will not forgive the Conservative Party for what they did to poor Boris. She loves him, doesn't she? She really has a thing for him.
I'm not getting into private grief, but the point when Nadine Dorries was appointed, she was an uber Boris Johnson loyalist. That's why she was appointed. Yeah. She then, when Boris Johnson was defenestrated, almost sort of Russian oligarch style, without the blood, by the Conservative Party because they realised that he was a massive vote loser. She switched horses and became a very vocal supporter of the current Prime Minister, Liz Truss. Except that this week, now it's become apparent that Liz Truss's her satisfaction numbers are now lower than Johnson's were when he was forced to resign, and potentially is leading the Conservative Party to a significant loss at the next general election. She's now saying that Truss has no mandate for what she's trying to do, and calling for a general election. The kind people might say she's making it up as she goes along.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. What though was the first thing that she made up in this particular position, this ministerial job that she was given?
Okay, so new viewers start here.
Yeah.
This is, and the reason we're telling this story, it's the first anniversary, really, of what I think is perhaps one of the more significant stories in recent heritage practice. It is the saga of the demolition of the Dorman Long Tower in Redcar on the northeast coast, and how it came about, and the arguments behind the scenes that went on. Now, it attracted everybody's attention because it all happened in a very short period of time in August and September last year, 2021.
Yeah, we reported on it. There's a very famous bit of footage at like 3 a.m. was it? I think, of the explosion going off.
That's right. It was demolished in the early hours of a Sunday morning.
Yeah, so link below to check that out.
Yeah, but what lies behind it is the interesting part, and it is very relevant to the current arguments about investment zones, as the government likes to call them, free ports, as the previous government called them. The idea that there can be places in the country where planning regulations and other environmental regulations can be, quotes, liberalised, or even removed. Maybe we'll come back to that in the discussion at the end. But basically, what happened was, there is an area of the northeast on Teesside, on the River Tees, which has been designated, or was designated under the Johnson government, as the Teesside Freeport. It is currently administered by an organisation called Teesworks, which is headed up by the democratically elected Conservative mayor of Tees Valley, who's called Ben Houchen.
Yes.
Ben Houchen is a a rising star in the Conservative Party. He's seen as one of their biggest regional assets. He's been very prominent in promoting in the area, in promoting as the current government would like growth and employment in the area. Nothing wrong with that. But also for being for having a very outspoken, larger than life presence in the media. He very much identifies himself with the area. It's his area. Now, again, that's something that is not that's not unique to him. It comes with having elected mayoral officials. Ken Livingstone in London, followed by Boris Johnson in London, now Sadiq Khan in London. Andy Burnham has a similar profile in Greater Manchester. Andy Street for the Conservatives in Birmingham just last week at the Birmingham conference. So, again, it's in many respects, Mayor Houchen is not unique.
No,
but he had heading up the local regional administration and this company Teesworks, which is in charge of the former Redcar Steelworks, which was began to be decommissioned about 5 years ago. He has an enormous amount of power and influence, and he was also very close to the previous Prime Minister Boris Johnson and the previous Chancellor of the Exchequer Rishi Sunak. It seemed every other week Rishi Sunak was up on Teesside with a high V on at some other post-industrial site, announcing a new company that was going to take up residents and bring jobs and so on and so on. Again, nothing per se wrong with that.
No.
The issue comes with a very large piece of brutalist concrete called the Dorman Long Tower, which was one of the last remaining elements of the once massive and massively important Redcar Steelworks. It was the leading local employer. It exported steel all over the world, including to build the Sydney Harbour Bridge. The Dorman Long part of it comes from the name of the company that actually owned the site before nationalisation. And the Dorman Long Tower was the remaining part of the coal handling system for the coke oven, for the furnaces. It's where the coal will come in on a railway line. It was next to a railway line, which is one of the reasons it was blown up early in the morning. The coal will come in by train. It will be transshipped onto conveyor belts into the storage tower. It was iconic because it was huge. It was brutalist, built in the 1950s, and it had the name of the company Dorman Long emblazoned on the side as a massive piece of public advertising. So with the demise of the steelworks, local heritage campaigners campaigned to have at least part of it retained as a memorial.
For example, I seem to recall there was a push to have the lettering, if possible, retained from the tower, that kind of thing.
Absolutely right. And there are also moves to retain some of the buildings and repurpose them as museums, memorials, symbols of industrial Teesside. And just for context, in other parts of the northeast that has happened. So there's a small pit head that's been turned into a small museum in South Shields. There's something further north in a place called Woodhorn, which is a whole mining complex, which has become a regional museum and archive. And alongside things like the Angel of the North, the Anthony Gormley statue, the Dorman Long Tower was already iconic, but could have become a really polished icon of that particular part of the world. But obviously we're talking if buts and maybes. And again, I would say do check out that previous report from the Time for a little bit more context on that. So basically what we're talking about is moves to give the tower a future life as a symbol of the local community. It's what is routine now in heritage. The term is placemaking. It's about giving places identity, pride in their history, therefore ownership of the present and hope for the future, because these things can become part of an ongoing narrative. It's heritage being used entirely positively, not just to, for the sake of it, or to hold up development, or as some critics might argue, this is absolutely routine historical practice, heritage practice. Unfortunately for the Dorman Long Tower, Mayor Houchen saw the tower as really an impediment to the bright industrial future of the Teesside Freeport. What we know, and the story we're telling, is from the point of view of some extensive Freedom of Information Act releases. There are gaps which I'll point to, but the basic narrative comes from the Freedom of Information Act releases, which I've had from Historic England, from Mayor Houchen's organisations on Teesside, and from the Department for Culture, Digital Culture, Media and Sport. So 3 principal sources of FOI, plus a lot of material that's been published either online or in the local and national media, which provided the additional commentary. But basically, last August 2021, Mayor Houchen was engaged in trying to promote the Teesside Freeport as a site for new factories, particularly for renewables, wind farming in particular, because it's on a navigable river adjacent to the North Sea. It was seen as a potential centre for construction and maintenance for example, North Sea wind farms.
And then they can be brought in and taken out quite easily up and down that access point. Makes sense.
Exactly that. And again, nothing wrong with that. It provides modern high-tech jobs in an area that has been suffering from a great deal of deprivation since the demise of the mass industries like chemicals and steel, which have been the main employers in the chemicals, steel and shipbuilding were the 3 principal employers in the Northeast until the 1970s. So in principle, nothing wrong with it. But it now appears that as part of the negotiations in the international companies that they were trying to attract, plus a series of complicated land deals and refinancings, which have been arranged with local entrepreneurs. And these have been, if you want to read about that in detail, look at recent issues of Private Eye magazine, where the journalists at Private Eye have done a brilliant job in exposing the almost labyrinthine negotiations and deals that lie behind the Teesside Freeport that Mayor Houchen is at the centre of. But it appears that by August last year, they'd reached the point where having the Dorman Long Tower survive long term was an impediment, in that it not so much because it was taking up a lump of space, because you can design around something like that. People design around heritage objects all the time.
Well, on a site that big, when we're talking about square miles or square kilometres, the footprint wasn't that large. No,
precisely. No. But what it would have been a financial sink on the potential buyer, because anyone buying the site, taking on the site, would have taken on a heritage building which required TLC care and maintenance before you even start, potentially showing it off to the public. So it was not seen as an obvious profit center. And in fact, to say, for example, a multinational based elsewhere in Europe or in North America or in the Far East, it would actually be, why are we got to bother with this? Why should we sink money into this?
So
nothing to do with us.
So you could say that this local monument was anti-growth.
You could argue that some people would see it as anti-growth. To be honest, the amounts of money that were projected, and I'll come to this in a minute, but the amounts properly in a minute, but the amounts of money that were projected to actually maintain the thing are accounting errors for very large companies.
Yes.
But anyway, so cut to the chase. Last August, it appears that Mayor Houchen and the management of the site, Teesworks, hatched a plan to demolish the Dorman Long Tower, which had at that time had no heritage protection, although people had talked about trying to protect it. They announced that they were going to do this, and in response, campaigners for the tower placed a request with Historic England North East, the local office of Historic England, for what's called an emergency listing. That's what people do when they perceive that a heritage building or a heritage site is in immediate danger. And if Historic England agree with them, then they can place an emergency listing on the and recommend it to the Secretary of State, and that's normally signed off, and then there's a more considered debate about what's going to happen.
So it provides some breathing room then.
Exactly. Yeah. It prevents somebody gaming the system by blowing something up or demolishing something before it can be listed. Now, I mean, there was a case recently in Bristol, for example, where a developer ripped out I think it was Jacobean, a 17th century plaster interior from a building, literally hours before it could be listed. They knew it was going to be it was likely to be listed by Historic England, so they went ahead and destroyed it anyway, and there's nothing that anybody could do about it. It was perfectly illegal.
Okay.
Because they had planning permission for the building.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of thing we're talking about here. So here you've got a lot more money in play. You've got this major site, major interest, both Tees Works, the government standing behind all this in terms of funding the or at least, well, claiming to be funding the Tees Freeport. We'll come to that in a bit maybe as well. Certainly Private Eye have covered this. And so we get to the stage where Houchen and Tees Works want the Dorman long gone. Local campaigners want it saved, and they've got an emergency listing out of Historic England. Now, the emergency listing came out on a Friday. Over the weekends, the emails that I've looked at show that Houchen and his team basically mobilized. And they mobilized on two levels. They mobilized in terms of a PR campaign, and they also mobilized in terms of the formal process of questioning the emergency listing. Now, and again, to the one of the responses was a press release which talked about the emergency listing being a mistake and having been put into action by a junior member of staff at Historic England. I'll come back to that in a minute.
Okay. Yeah, okay.
So basically, by the Monday morning, and we're talking about September of the 13th of September 2021, there were discussions going on Teesside within Historic England North East. The political sensitivity of all this had been recognised by Historic England, and they had escalated the decision making to the national headquarters of Historic England in London, and it was being overseen by Duncan Wilson, chief executive. It was seen as being that sensitive. And we know from the FOIs that senior staff at Historic England were brought together in a meeting. Now, also the DCMS, Digital Culture, Media and Sport, then under the Secretary of State Oliver Dowden, was also involved, because the DCMS signs off on listings.
Yes, of course, yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So Historic England, the way the British system works, Historic England advise that a historic site is worthy of protection under listing or scheduling, depending on whether it's a building or archaeology. And the Secretary of State then makes a decision to take the advice or not take the advice.
Yes.
What happened next is that the case was in effect taken out of the local office's hands and was to be re-decided by a negotiation between Historic England, the DCMS, and Tees Works, Mayor Houchen. It's a bit like, and the local campaigns and so on are nothing to do with this. This has been, it's a bit like, and I make the analogy in the piece I've written about it. It's a bit like an amateur Northern Leagues football team having taken the lead against a Teesside team like Middlesbrough, who are in the Championship, the in the second tier of English football, at home, only to have the professionals involved have the match abandoned and arrange a replay in their at their stadium on their terms, and probably appointing the referee as well.
Right. Okay.
And the T's combined authority were sensitive enough about what was going on that there was an email circulated to all staff, which basically imposed a media and social media blackout on the whole issue. Nobody was to make any comment about it except through the official channels, even on private personal social media. Now, again, it's not unusual for companies to do that or remind staff that, if they recognise they've been with an organisation, whatever. But I think it just shows the sensitivities that were involved in this. And the biggest sensitivity is money. Potentially what's going on is going to be very expensive for somebody.
Yeah. So at this point, they're pitching the playing field and they're making it so that no one can turn up to the match, as it were. Almost. Yeah, exactly. You read the email traffic and you can almost see people who've been campaigning, including some of the local councillors and MPs, who are almost sort of pitching in from the sidelines. They're shouting support from the sidelines. They don't know what's going on the pitch. No.
By the 14th of September, they've arranged an emergency site meeting. Again, with very senior people from all parties involved. This has been escalated right to the top. And Houchen is there to effectively guide everybody around the site and explain what the site is going to be used for, how important it is to the local economy, and so on and so on. Again, nothing particularly wrong with that, apart from the fact that the only people representing the heritage community there are Historic England.
Yeah.
Not local campaigners, not experts in industrial and 20th century architecture or anything like that, just Historic England.
So therefore one could be left with the impression that it's just an ivory tower organisation that wants to preserve a curio for themselves, as opposed to there being local interest and community interest in this.
Well. Remember that the mayor's press release talks about a mistake and talks about a junior member of staff, somebody who doesn't understand.
Yeah, and doesn't understand the local people or what they want. Yeah.
No. And in fact, somebody in DCMS headquarters emailed a counterpart in Historic England and laid it absolutely out on the line, as though just in case Historic England didn't understand what was going on. But this is somebody from the DCMS who have, again, people might think should be refereeing the process, but said, and this is a quote from an email: "I'm really sure the mayor will make these points, but there is significant local and national investment potentially at risk if this review drags on. So would hope to complete the review as swiftly as possible." They're trying to they're now starting to try and railroad the whole decision-making process.
It should also be said, that this comes at a time when the national government in London is looking for wins. They're looking for international trade wins. They're looking for internal economic boosts that they can claim. So that's one of the reasons that a cabinet minister now is seemingly, that the ministry is seemingly interested in speeding this up a little bit.
Yeah. Now there's another couple of things I think to bear in mind here. As this discussion is starting, it appears that both DCMS officials and officials at Historic England were expecting whatever decision was made about the review for it to be accompanied by a 21-day consulting period. That's standard practice, although it's not statutory.
No.
And it can be shortened or lengthened. The other thing that appears clear from the email traffic is that Historic England certainly was under the impression that the only real deadline was the following weekend, the 15th of September. Later in the week, the 15th of September, because the demolition was due the following weekend.
I see, yes.
And the 15th of December was when a go no go decision had to be made about demolition that weekend. Now, once that deadline was passed, it appears Historic England thought the only procedural concern was that they followed due process within a reasonable time period, didn't unduly extend it, because if the review found in favour of Houchen and Teeswork's view, then the building would come down and everything would have been done legally and properly. And they would have played their role absolutely appropriately. But it did that. Both of those things didn't happen, as we see. Basically, the decision after the site meeting lay with the DCMS and Secretary of State Oliver Dowden.
Yes.
It's now, the other thing to bear in mind here is that it is absolutely clear from the email traffic that, and from public statements, that Historic England did not waver from its recommendation that the Dorman Long should be listed Grade 2.
No.
They, even after Teesworks and their consultants presented other information that they allege wasn't available for to these officers making the first listing, they did not waver from their contention that it was a significant building that merited placing on the national list at Grade 2.
Yeah. Okay.
But what is also going on in the background here is an email that was sent to the Secretary of State's private office, copied to Mayor Houchen, which again was putting more pressure on the DCMS. Quote, just a quick note to prompt the decision on delisting Dorman Long Tower needs to be done ASAP. If decision is to delist, we need notification by 10 a.m. tomorrow morning to go ahead with the demolition. That's the evening of the 15th. So
who's that from?
It's now again, problem with most FOIs is that the originator and whatever are redacted.
Okay.
So, but we can say this is from a senior official to Oliver Dowden's office, copied to Mayor Houchen, and it's putting pressure on the DCMS.
Okay. A watching brief is a formal programme of observation and investigation to record and report on notable discoveries on an archaeological site. As part of our ongoing watching brief, Andy and I work hard to bring you the best, the worst, and sometimes the more quirky happenings from the world of archaeology. We aim to provide a space where voices can be heard, opinions shared, and sometimes truth spoken to power. If you believe in the work we do, please consider supporting us on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. Thank you.
But what has also just happened is that because he's got into one of his periodic scrapes with the media and with Parliament, Boris Johnson has carried out a snap cabinet reshuffle. The Secretary of State, who had been due to take the decision, Oliver Dowden, is switched to be chairman of the Conservative Party.
And the decision is required by what, 10 p.m. was it?
But basically, according to one timeline, the time to take the decision has actually passed. Right. So they're in. It's like the scene in Hunt for Red October when, you know, they're heading for the wall of the canyon, and Sean Connery is waiting to turn the submarine. You know, it's that close to disaster for one side or another.
Yeah.
Anyway, so Dowden is switched, and to the expectation of nobody whatsoever, the new Secretary of State is announced as being Nadine Dorries. Now, Nadine.
Sorry, go on.
At that point, Nadine Dorries was famous for several things, none of which are particular involvements in culture, apart from the fact she's a very successful novelist of a particular kind of novel.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
She she's certainly good at getting headlines. She once described her blog of her parliamentary activities as and I need to get the quote right. There we are. 70% fiction and 30% fact.
Okay.
Although she later claimed that had actually been a joke. She was famous for eating kangaroo anus on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here.
Kangaroo, not ostrich. Yeah.
Yeah. She was also, but as a result of that, she was suspended from the whip by the Conservative Party because she hadn't got permission to go to Australia to film the series. She then refused to disclose how much she was paid for filming the series.
Yeah.
And she got into another scrape by employing her daughter on a salary of £40,000 as an office manager.
What a public servant. What a public servant.
Yeah, well, she was she was an entrepreneur. She was an employer. She also employed her sister as a senior secretary on something around 30 to 35k.
Yeah.
And she's got into various spats and scrapes on social media as well, in particular with the broadcaster James O'Brien, who claims that she basically said untrue things about him under parliamentary privilege.
Yeah.
But she had a political career, and at this point she was a junior minister at the Department of Health. Early in her adult life, she trained as a nurse and practiced as a nurse. So, and she'd had particular responsibility, for example, for things like mental health. But
I have no words.
I left the pause there because I thought I'd leave it for you to.
I have no words.
Fill that particular gap.
So she's given this position, a relatively important position in the cabinet.
What we've got to remember here, she's an uber government loyalist. And that's why she's been put in the post.
Mm-hmm.
So when she gets there, when she gets her feet behind the desk in Whitehall, she is presented with this as one of her first public decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the decision that she made was to delist.
Yeah.
It was to override Historic England's recommendation from the initial emergency listing and from the review.
Yeah.
Right.
And as we reported at the time, based on raw opinion, not much in the way of consultation or reasoning. It was just her opinion. Yeah.
The opinion was dressed up as information, as an argument, and again, the letters have now been released. But basically, Teesworks was informed of the decision officially at just gone 1:30 on the 16th of September, middle of the day. But they'd actually been informed unofficially earlier.
Right.
So they knew that they could carry on with the demolition.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
The FOIs don't shed any light at all, really, on the discussions within the DCMS within those first hours of Nadine Dorries' tenure in office.
Mm-hmm.
But I think two things are pretty clear. They appear to be driven by the need to achieve the delisting, and Mayor Houchen and Teesworks were using that deadline as a lever to put pressure on the Secretary of State.
Mm-hmm.
And they were definitely applying pressure through back channels, including direct emails and text messages.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Now, there's a tactical reason for doing that, and it's to limit the window of opportunity for campaigners to seek a judicial review of any decision to delist. Houchen, the emails show, had a go team ready, a legal go team ready if somebody tried to bring a judicial review.
Okay.
And the second thing is that Houchen and perhaps the DCMS, though it's not as clear, but they were pretty pissed off. Houchen was certainly really pissed, to use an American term, that Historic England hadn't rolled over and accepted that they had made a, quotes, mistake.
Yeah. Particularly when he said it was done by a junior person who didn't know what the heck they were doing. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
And that kind of casting shade on Historic England gets worse. If you look at the delisting letter that's signed off by Nadine Dorries, it's drafted by her civil servant, signed off by Nadine Dorries. It doesn't mention. It mentions. Well, this is what it says. quote, with the benefit of Historic England's latest advice and the evidence contained within the review request, the Secretary of State is, on balance, persuaded of the arguments in favour of delisting the Dorman Long Tower. It doesn't make clear that Historic England was still in favour of maintaining the listing.
How long did she have, can we say, to consider these arguments?
It's a matter of hours, and she's probably dealing with private advice from civil servants, which hasn't come under the FOI.
Right. So this would be people saying your predecessor was considering that kind of thing.
This is exactly that.
Yeah.
Now, my hunch is, and again, I don't have any reason for saying this apart from looking at the mood music, is that the DCMS was looking for ways for as civil servants do, quite rightly, for the Culture Secretary to follow government policy, and government policy was to promote free ports and so on and so on and so on. Mm-hmm. And here they had a contentious story. I suspect they felt that they could contain any media fallout, because who's going to go to the barricades for a 60-year-old pile of brutalist concrete? It's not Canterbury Cathedral or Stonehenge. Mm-hmm. So, on balance, they decided that, it was a relatively painless decision to give Historic England a kicking. And in fact, possibly in terms of future cases, it might put Historic England back in its box in terms of making too many recommendations for listing that could get in the way of government, growth plans, for want of a better word.
Yeah, yeah. Now, of course, Dorries went on to have that sort of relationship with listing as well. I think her last act, or one of her final acts, was to list a fairly unremarkable plaque close to the Cecil Rhodes statue, almost as a sort of a stamp of, look what I can do. So it's someone who wants to pull levers and wants to be seen to be pulling levers and so on and so forth, yeah.
And to be seen to be pulling levers for particular parts of the Conservative Party and the Conservative Party base.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you can bet that she would know that the Treasury and Rishi Sunak was closely identified with the policy of free ports, and was absolutely, at least in public, 110% behind what Houchen was trying to promote online.
Okay.
Now, interesting is the responses from outside. The former Labour MP called Anna Turley, who lost her seat in the 2020 general election. Bedcar was one of the red that went Conservative, said, wow, so that's it. Ben Houchen's Tees Works will be demolishing the historic Dorman Long Tower and losing one of the last iconic industrial landmarks on Teesside. But then also she noted that there's no route for Redcar and Cleveland Council to appeal.
No.
A Redcar councillor, Vincent Smith, said the Dorman Long Tower is a historic landmark and a much-loved manifestation of our steel heritage, and is specifically recognised in the council's local plan policy. And that was the point. Up until August 2021, the local plan said it should be retained as a heritage element of new developments.
Well, I seem to recall, wasn't there footage of Houchen in front of the tower saying this thing's amazing, local people, blah, 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 blah. Yeah. So, okay, yeah. So I'm not taking crazy pills there. That did happen. Yeah.
No. And Smith added, sadly, it seems this important building will be demolished without planning permission and without any consultation or discussion with local people. Both those two things are true, and they're both absolutely legal.
Yeah.
They were Tees Works was using powers to demolish, to the extent that the only thing that they require permission for is the method of demolition.
Yes.
There
in so much as it has environmental impacts for sound, dust.
That's
so
exactly
so
that. Exactly right. Right.
Yeah.
And then he made the suggestion that maybe, as we alluded to earlier, the playing field, the stadium, wasn't entirely level, and the referee might have been a homer. He said that the survey that has been carried out on behalf the survey, and this is a report which I'll come to in a sec, which was presented at the review meeting, argued that the tower was too badly damaged and too expensive to retain. He pointed out that the survey has been carried out on behalf of the people who want to demolish the tower.
Yes.
At the same time, the council leader, a woman called Mary Lanigan, said, if we did what some are asking us to do, some campaigners are asking to do, and that failed. The South Tees Development Corporation could sue this council because of the delay. And again, she's exactly right. The system allows for that. Anyway, this is where it starts to get a bit tasty. Houchen said, following the submission of an appeal on Sunday, the 12th of September, I can now confirm Historic England and the new Secretary of State have overturned the listing in the Dorman Long Tower. That is not true. No. Secretary of State overturned the listing. All Historic England did was advise.
Right.
As is absolutely correct.
And their advice didn't change.
Their advice didn't change.
No. No.
He then added, approving our appeal was the first decision of the new Secretary of State. This goes to show how important successful redevelopment of the Redcar former steelworks site is to everyone in government. He then got his retaliation in against the heritage campaigners who tried to get the listing in the first place. He said, this reverses the decision on its Grade 2 listing made after an application by local activists that, if allowed to stand, would have cost the taxpayer in excess of £9 million. Would that
be activists part of a anti-growth coalition?
I would imagine exactly so. He's using basically he was using a trigger word for the Conservative Party base. The figure of £9 million was plucked out of the air. It wasn't defined at all. He then laid out this kind of apocalyptic vision of what would have happened if the tower had been retained. He said, that's money that would not be spent on the creation of jobs, the NHS, transport and other important services. Worse than that, it would have cost thousands of jobs and hundreds of millions of pounds in investment that we were and still are trying to bring to the site where the Dorman Long Tower currently stands. None of that is true. He can't demonstrate any of that.
No.
There is no evidence that retaining the Dorman Long Tower would have prevented any inward investment at all, apart from it might have been a possible negotiating issue that it was a heritage building that none of the incoming companies wanted to take on. Now, and this is the bit that caused Houchen a real problem, because he then went on his press release to maintain the football analogy. He went in studs up at Historic England. He said, Historic England has...
For our international viewer, that's a dangerous tackle.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. It's going in at your opponent's shin with the studs of your boots pointing at the shin.
Thank you.
And you get a straight red card if you do it. You get sent off and you can't carry on in the game any longer.
Yeah.
Houchen goes studs up at Historic England. He says, Historic England has accepted that the listing was a mistake. It was made by a junior officer who agreed to the listing without ever seeing the structure itself. The application that was made was inaccurate, incomplete and misleading and would have put the progress and jobs at risk. Again, the first part is certainly not true, and the second sentence is almost certainly and certainly arguably not true.
It's wild speculation based on the first untruth. Yeah. So exactly. It's I state my fact. My fact is true. Therefore, my fact that it is drawn from my fact is also true. Yeah. It's the ancient aliens argument. Yeah.
Anyway, 17th of September. This press release has come out, and people in Historic England are absolutely furious. There's an email that says, quote, is there anything we can do about this total misrepresentation of our by-the-book actions? We were able to visit the site, and after further assessment, we confirmed our previous advice that the tower merits consideration for listing Grade 2. And Historic England, which is not an organisation which has a reputation for being robust in its comms, and certainly in terms of defending itself.
It's often gentle.
Told the Telegraph, no, the listing was not a mistake. This is the Historic England press office telling the Telegraph the listing was not a mistake. And then it reiterated that as far as Historic England was concerned, the building should be listed Grade 2. The Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport agreed, and the building was listed. Following a review of the information, and our recommendation remained the same. However, DCMS, which takes the decision on all listing cases, has decided to remove its listed status.
Yeah.
So, in other words, Historic England played it by the book. And I have to say, having looked at the email trails and those 3 email trails, they are right. There's no sign that there was any internal debate over what they've done. In fact, that they appear to have played it by the book, as the email suggested, and they were really pretty cross about the way Houchen.
Well, the way that a regional mayor was characterising them,
yes,
absolutely,
yeah. 18th of September, early hours of the morning, the Dorman Tower and 3 other structures were blown up in a controlled explosion.
And Nadine Dorries became Dynamite Dorries.
We did coin the hashtag Dynamite Dorries.
Yes,
which I must admit, in it being petty and childish as I am, I maintained throughout her tenure in the at the DCMS. But the interesting stuff in the wash up for this. The report that Houchen had relied on to say the Dorman Tower was unsustainable, was badly damaged and would have to be demolished within 20 years anyway, was finally published after the event. It hadn't been available for peer review before the event. It was commissioned from Houchen's people, by Houchen's people, from the consultant Atkins, perfectly legitimate consultancy, but it was commissioned, I suspect, with a particular purpose in mind, I suspect, on the part of Houchen, certainly. It was looked at after publication by local experts. In particular, there's an expert website called Something Concrete and Modern, which looks at industrial and concrete architecture in the Northeast. And they concluded that the report was, quote, threadbare, that the figure of 8 to 9 million to secure the future of the tower was, quote, an unqualified ballpark figure, that there was no justification within the report for the view that Houchen had put out that the tower will have to be demolished within 20 years. The evidence in the report merely suggested the structure would require additional structural work within that period. It was also pointed out that the money saved by cancelling the demolition, plus a relatively small investment, coupled with the kind of match funding from the National Lottery, which is absolutely common in large-scale heritage projects, could have seen the Dorman Tower retained as a landmark heritage building for at least a generation.
So the mugs, tea towels, postcards, people coming to take photographs, regional school children coming to learn about their industrial heritage.
But there's an even more damning conclusion from the independent review, which is that Houchen and his people may have misrepresented safety issues connected with the Dorman Tower. One of the prime issues at stake was that the tower was unsafe, and it had to be demolished quickly, and it was unsafe and too expensive. The financial case has been demolished by the independent review. They look at the safety case and they say, quote, the report notes, Atkins' own report notes, there was no imminent risk of collapse, suggesting no safety reason for the rapid demolition, brackets, the key reason given for the rush. Instead, Ben Houchen and the MP for the site, Jacob Young, continued up to the last minute that it was unsafe, a statement that is, quote, categorically untrue. The 20th Century Society also issued a statement. Catherine Croft, their Director of Expert Conservation, said, this is a case, is an example of how not to take irreversible decisions about heritage. Decision-making has been extremely rushed. There has been no time for informed public debate, and many expert bodies, including the 20th Century Society, have not been able to make their views known before a significant historical structure has been reduced to rubble. And they concluded it's a very bad start for the new Secretary of State at the Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sport. The local outlet, Northeast Bylines, said, in the minds of his supporters, if Houchen has to twist things to secure victory against those he claims wish to run the area down, then so be it. And for that reason, we can expect that even though the figure of 9 million has been debunked, it will continue to be repeated, as will the myth of the junior employee at Historic England. And the cost of the savings to local taxpayers and the NHS and conservation cost jobs. And we're seeing that currently in the argument about the government's dash for growth, growth, growth. Its desire announced by Kwasi Kwarteng and the government's growth plan to liberalise and remove, in some cases, the requirements for planning permission.
But now, I guess just to really hammer that home, just to be really, really clear about that, all of what you've described there in painstaking detail, and obviously we'll link to Andy's written piece below and other relevant links as well. All of that happened with the current planning legislation that we also had when we were still in the European Union. So this stuff is stuff that we co-authored, that we still have in law, and is set to be potentially sunsetted and not replaced in the near future. But despite those protections being in place, this sort of case was made, was, as some people have said, given inadequate space to breathe and to be discussed, and was effectively railroaded through based solely on an ideology, really, an ideological reasoning as to what this space should look like and what economic growth means for this space. As opposed to potentially, for example, as you would if you were building a swimming pool, getting alternative quotes, getting alternative visions, getting alternative ideas about what the economic growth for that particular site might be.
The buzzwords that were used by Houchen and Teesworks and the people who were pro the demolition were that the land had to be, quotes, remediated and investor ready. In other words, there was nothing in the way of the investment. Now, there are two things I'd like to add just to finish, and you're summing up really well the importance of this. But there are two developments really that happened really in the important information has come in the last 10 days. But the first one was back in July of this year, 2022. The company that the land was being cleared for, which is called GE Renewables, pulled out of the Teesworks project.
What? Okay, so go on, and
Mayor Houchen said that their loss, and he said of GE Renewables,
their loss.
If you snooze. Yeah, he said if you snooze, you lose. I.e., if they didn't want to be part of the dynamic new northeast Teesside development, that was their problem.
Did he also invoke finders keepers, losers weepers? I'm just wondering.
Well, that's it. But I mean, the other part of this is much more serious.
Do you know? Sorry, can I just say you have told me that before, but clearly I've ejected it from my head because I didn't want to think that happened.
Yeah, it was all done for a company that has now pulled out of the project.
You've just taken me right back to that moment. So go on, continue.
Okay. The last thing, and actually it's the much more serious thing. Last year in 2021, there was a massive unexplained die-off of crabs, lobsters, and other shellfish on the northeast coast. It decimated the local fishing industry. And there was a lot of speculation about what was causing it. Initial comments by DEFRA, the Department for the Environment and Agriculture and Food, said that they thought that a toxic algal bloom might be to blame. Local people said, we think it's industrial pollution. Work was commissioned from Newcastle University, and they looked in particular at a chemical called pyridine, which is a byproduct of burning coal in steelworks. They identified pyridine identified in the bodies of the shellfish and crabs and lobsters that have been washed up on beaches and pulled up dead or dying. And it turns out that pyridine is a virulent neurotoxin for crabs and shellfish and lobsters.
Right.
It destroys their nervous system. And it destroys their nervous system at much lower concentrations than had previously been thought, and certainly have been thought by DEFRA.
Mm-hmm.
And the conclusion, the preliminary conclusion, which has gone out on a Newcastle University press release, is that the northeast coast die-offs are due to pyridine pollution. There is a strong suggestion that the pyridine that has been washed into the North Sea water column has been put there by dredging operations in the River Tees to support the Teesside Freeport.
And so, just to be clear, then that would be historic matter. That would be stuff from the 19th and 20th centuries that's been in the silt and now has been disturbed, right?
Exactly that.
Yeah.
It's like digging in your garden and finding a Victorian cesspit.
Oh, okay.
It is over a century of pollutants washed from the site, ending up in the mud of the river, that is then being disturbed by dredging operations, and the tide is taking it out into the North Sea, and then the modelling shows it being distributed down the coast to exactly the locations where the dead sea creatures, the crabs, the shellfish, the lobsters, were living.
Okay. Sorry, I'm laughing because, well, if I didn't, I'd scream. So this is a this has been, folks at home, this has been a case study. This has been an example, as I say, of what happens and what has happened, even with planning regulations in place. Currently, we are in a situation where, following the Chancellor of the Exchequer's most recent mini budget, there's very strong language indicating a likelihood of a tendency towards reducing environmental protections and therefore as well heritage protections in places that they want to see develop in these so-called development zones. It's this same policy that Johnson's government, and let's be clear, this is the same party and some of the very same ministers. I mean, this isn't like a new, it's not a whole new administration. But on this, Johnson's government had a real desire to see through. It's a continuation of that sort of policies, but slightly repackaged. And I suppose the great big question mark here is what would be possible with fewer protections. What would be possible with less in the way of protections? Because it should also be said as well that the northeast crustacean stock is important. People catch that stuff. I mean, in North Shields, there's a daily fish market, and crustaceans are part of the offering. So in that sense, I can scarcely even begin to imagine what might be possible with fewer protections. I mean, where would you like to see this conversation go next? I mean, we should probably be thinking about wrapping this one up. But what would you like to see colleagues and people below and elsewhere talking about in terms of what we've just laid out and what might be on the horizon?
I think two things. The immediate thing, faced with the government's growth plan and Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng's stated intention to do away, and the government's stated intention to do away with European Union law, which would include things like the environment directives, and the some, if not all, environmental checks and balances, certainly in some areas and maybe across the country. Somebody made the point the other day that if something's good for one area of the country, which you call a free port or an investment zone, why do you then not roll it out to the rest of the country? So I think I would like to see archaeologists and particularly archaeological bodies perhaps show a little more urgency and a little more proactive activity in this discussion. Because as you say, the Dorman Long and the pyridine die-offs, if that's what they are, and it looks as though almost certainly they are, came from the current system of with environmental checks and balances and planning permission and reserved rights such as demolition without the need for full planning permission, and so on and so on and so on. And the ultimate listing, veto. The ultimate protection of listing was tried, and for reasons which still aren't entirely clear, were thrown out. For example, another thing that turned up in the FOI, for example, was text messages between Mayor Houchen and Nadine Dorries' office, saying that he was in London and available for an immediate meeting. He was lobbying when this is meant to be an objective process. And that ability to lobby was not there for even the local MP or former MP. So it wasn't a level playing field.
No. And that's the playing field we currently probably need to fight to hold on to. Yeah.
Precisely that. Precisely that. So that's one thing. The other thing, and you mentioned earlier on at the top of this particular package that I often say that it's not the natural environment and the historic environment, it's the environment. I think this actually points that up. You've got a historic building that's blown up and destroyed, and a local industry that is almost destroyed, certainly set back many years, with some people even leaving the industry altogether because of what's happened, if reports are to be believed. And it's all happened because there was no proper debate, no proper analysis, no employment of the checks and balances, or if in checks and balances, the organisations that were meant to employ checks and balances. For example, in the case of the die-offs, DEFRA has been really criticised for having no curiosity about why why shellfish and crabs and so on were dying in their millions on the northeast coast. The argument being that because it's a government organisation reliant on the government for its funding, it didn't want to rock the boat. So and in fact, all credit to Historic England for being as robust as it actually was in sticking to its guns. Over the Dorman long. What they did in PR terms was they said, okay, we've made our recommendation. We're going to make it absolutely clear that what the decision has been made by the Secretary of State, which is the legal position, but they were reinforcing that because they didn't want to get blamed for this. It's pretty clear.
Yeah. And as big as those loopholes were, as thin as those veils between lobbyists and decision makers were, and as strong as the veto was in the end from Nadine Dorries, that is the system that's currently under threat of going away. And
the other thing, just to finish, Mark, the other thing I would say is, and I said there were two things I wanted to see. The second one really is, yes, of course, we have to exist within a political system. We have to, there are rules, and there are normal channels. But here Nadine Dorries chose not to implement the consultation period after she changed her mind on the listing. After she changed the decision on the listing. She chose not to consult because it was clear that they wanted the demolition to happen, and they wanted to leave as little time and chance as possible for anyone to intervene. And I think archaeologists need to understand, and archaeological bodies need to understand, that while they need to engage with these people, some of these people are actually bad actors. They do not have certainly the interests of the public that is concerned about heritage in mind. Now they might say, again, quite rightly, Houchen could say that, yeah, I'm elected. I'm elected to represent the people of the Northeast, and the interests of the people of the Northeast are best served by this going through. But they're not best served, I think, arguably, there's no evidence that anyone's done anything illegal.
No.
But the system, I think if people listen to this, reading the article, there's much more detail. might think that the system, if not used corruptly, has certainly been gamed.
Yeah, putting ideology and conclusions before consultation and discussion, which apparently the system is set up to facilitate. Okay, right. Well, let's leave that there. Please do continue the conversation below, folks. As I say, there'll be more reading and relevant links below. At this stage, do we know what we're talking about next week?
Well, you mean if Liz Truss is still Prime Minister?
Yep, exactly.
Honestly, people outside the UK, we are living in such a bizarre, just in the space of a month, we've lost one Prime Minister, the monarch of 70 years. We've gained another Prime Minister who's had her party conference, which is meant to be her showpiece. And it was dominated by talk of coups and whether she's going to survive the return to Parliament next week.
Yeah, and this is day 27, I think, of her.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Let's leave it there then. And thank you for watching, everyone at home. Thank you for your time, Andy. Until next time, guys, do take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.